Thank you for joining us early on a Sunday morning. We're here with three members of the Cambridge and Peterborough Climate Change Commission, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves in turn. We'll have some presentations, very, very brief presentations about the Commission, and then we will be answering questions that you have supplied to us. If you've used Zoom before or not, look down below at the tabs to ask questions. There's a question facility, and we will be picking up those questions as we go along. With that, may I begin by introducing Julia King, who is chair of the Commission.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm Julia King. I'm Baroness Brown of Cambridge. I live in Cambridge, and I'm also Vice Chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is the committee that sets the carbon budgets for the UK and also monitors the government's progress towards meeting them. And I'm delighted that we're taking this action in our local region.
Okay. Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Rhiannon Osborne, one of the commissioners.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon Osborne. I'm a medical student at the University of Cambridge, doing a lot of work on climate change and its impacts on health. So really excited to be part of the commission as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And thirdly, another member of the commission, Ben Shredder.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Tretter. I'm one of the independent commissioners. I work for the Behavioural Insights team, where I apply realistic models of human behaviour to public policy. Prior to that, I was chief executive of Cambridge United Community Trust and was born and brought up in Cambridge. I'm on the commission in an independent personal capacity, and it's been very enjoyable and exciting thus far.
Thank you all. And with that, Julia, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Well, of course, climate change is, if not the biggest, it's certainly one of the very biggest challenges facing mankind. And in particular, although we're beginning to see some impacts of it now, it really is going to be impacting future generations. And it really is up to us to take action now to make sure that the globe remains a habitable place for our children and our grandchildren and their successors. And we're all struggling at the moment to remember our name, on the Cambridge and Peterborough Independent Committee on Climate, I think is our final decision as to what we're called. We're looking at how the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority region can meet the net zero target by 2050. And indeed, how can we accelerate progress towards it? Because of course, it would be great to meet it earlier if we can. We really want to see how we can build on our strengths in the region, our natural assets like our land, the wind and the wind power, the sun and the solar energy that we generate locally, our great universities, so all that kind of intellect and innovation, and our innovative companies. And of course, building on the plans that the various councils and community groups around the region are already developing. We'll be looking also at how well prepared we are for the changing climate and what we need to do to improve our resilience. Are we ready to respond to the increasing water shortages we're likely to see in this part of the country, to the higher temperatures, to the increased risks of flooding? I'm very keen that the Commission produces not only a whole list of things we need to do to understand better the situation, but also some really important and immediate action that can be taken. So I'm very keen that our report is a combination of actions for now, as well as areas where we need further research and studies. Our recommendations will be directed towards the Combined Authority and the councils, of course. We'll have recommendations for businesses to how they can accelerate their move to net zero, and also for all of us who live here and for community groups of all kinds. And I'm sure also there'll be some things we need to tell the national government that they need to do to help us take really strong action locally. We're starting with transport and buildings because that's where most of our emissions in the region come from, although we're not forgetting that we have very significant emissions from peat. Transport is a key area because we drive more miles per head than the average in the UK. We need to understand why that is and what we can do about it. And buildings, of course, is important because the Oxford-Cambridge arc is an area expecting to provide a lot of the new housing in the southeast in the next 20 years. So there'll be increasing pressures from buildings on things like water use, but there'll also be a real requirement to make sure those new homes are going to be zero carbon. Of course, we can't look at transport, the electrification of transport particularly, and the electrification of heating in our homes without also looking at the local energy system. It's impossible not to consider these things as a system because they're so closely interconnected. As I've said, we're also going to look at the climate change risks, and we're going to have some work being done with Cambridge University and the Committee on Climate Change Adaptation Committee and the Environment Agency on that, so we really understand what we need to be prepared for. We're going to be moving on to look at business and industry, what they need to do to be prepared for climate change, but of course what our many innovative businesses can do actually to provide the products and services that will help us both adapt and reduce our emissions. Very importantly for the Fens, of course, we produce a lot of the UK's salad and food crops, so we're going to be looking at agriculture and land use. We're going to be looking at the issue of peat, because potentially the emissions from peat in the region could be as large as the rest of our emissions. So that's a very complex but a very important area for us. And we're going to be looking at water, because water availability for the future, for all these new houses and for that agriculture is also really key. And then we're going to have a chapter in our final report on what we as individuals can do, because I know people often say, well, how can I do? Well, how can I help? What can I do to make sure I'm part of this change? How can I change my behaviours and what I do at home, for example? So we're going to be thinking quite a lot about that and trying to pull together information so that we can all feel engaged in this. In terms of timescales, we'll be producing a draft report on some of our early studies, so on homes, transport and power in February. The timing of this is because of the local elections, so we have to get something out before PERDA, because clearly we can't be publishing something just as we're coming up in the electioneering period, so to speak. So that's what we're focusing on most closely at the moment, and hopefully that'll be ready, as I say, fairly early in the new year. And then we hope to have a report on all of the areas we're looking at later in the summer. That may be our final report, but I hope that we will continue with a monitoring role beyond that, because somebody needs to be looking to see whether the actions we're recommending are being implemented. We have a fantastic and diverse group of 12 commissioners from a wide range of backgrounds who are all giving their time for free, and you're meeting 3 of us here today. But let me tell you a little bit about the others. We have Richard Astle, who's the MD of a company called Athene Communications and is chair of Natural Cambridgeshire. We have the very Reverend Mark Bonney, who's Dean of Ely Cathedral. We've got Dame Polly Curtis, who's a board member of Anglian Water, but also runs the Cambridge Centre for Sustainability Leadership. We've got Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon, who's a climate economist. Dr. Emily Shuckburgh, who's a very well-known climate scientist and who is leading the Cambridge Zero programme for Cambridge University. We've got Lynn Sullivan, who's an award-winning architect known for her eco homes programmes. We've got John Shropshire, the chairman of G's Fresh, which is a huge farming to market business with lots of farms in the Fens and East Anglia. So he knows the area and its challenges well. We've got Russell Pico, who's a finance specialist and a board member of HSBC, who's going to help us look at how do we fund some of these important things we need to do. And we've got Greg Archer, who's a low carbon transport specialist, who's worked for many, many years on low carbon transport policy, both in the UK and in Europe. We want to approach our recommendations by taking a systems view, because so many of these things are so interconnected. And we've got a very strong focus on the co-benefits of climate action, such as improved public transport and more green space. And Rhiannon is going to tell you about the approach that we've developed. We're also launching a short questionnaire, which is now live on our website, and a survey to find out what your views are, and indeed also to find out more about what good practice is already going on in the region. And Ben's been closely involved in developing this, and he's going to tell you about it. And just, can I emphasize, please do get in touch if you want to know more or if you want to tell us something. And you can do this via our website. So http://bit.ly/CPICC home. And we'll make sure that you can easily find that and don't have to try and remember it. So let me now hand over to Rhiannon. Rhiannon.
Great, thank you very much, Julia. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hopefully this will go smoothly. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay. Okay. Going to take that as a yes. Okay, so yeah, as Julia said, we're really keen to think about climate change in the context of the wider social and economic lives of people living in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, because climate change doesn't exist in a vacuum, and neither does any of the recommendations that we would like to make. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the other aspects of people's lives and our societies as we go through our recommendations. So from our very first meeting, we had discussions about how to incorporate the wider social, economic and environmental issues in our work, whilst obviously sticking to the core mandate of achieving climate stability in the region through reducing emissions and increasing resilience. And we wanted to think about the ways in which we can improve the lives of communities through climate action. So using climate action to make improvements in other areas that people really care about. And when we were researching what kind of approach it would be good to take, we were really inspired by the work of Kate Raworth, who you can see on the screen there, and her concept of donor economies, which is basically societies and economies that take care of people and planet kind of as a whole. And so what we did was then we went away and developed our own little donut, which you can see on the other side of the screen, which basically outlines our own set of secondary priorities for the actions that we recommend. So you can see in the middle, our main aim is climate stability by reducing emissions and increasing resilience. But we also want to make sure that our work brings wider benefits to the region wherever possible. And you can see some of the areas that we've highlighted and that we're really keen to improve and work on through our recommendations on the outside of the little ring there. So I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail now. So basically in the climate space, these are generally referred to as co-benefits. So a co-benefit is basically kind of, as we've already discussed, the secondary benefits you get from taking climate action, and they're known as co-benefits. So you take the action with the aim of taking climate action, but then in the way that you design your recommendation or your policy or your financing, you also try and bring these co-benefits, so the other secondary benefits, to the people that your recommendation is impacting. So they're basically additional social and economic benefits from taking climate action. And what you can do is you can design your climate action and your recommendations and your policies to get the most out of these. So to maximize the co-benefits of whatever action you take. So yeah, as I put on the screen, it's a little extract, but basically there is huge potential for climate action across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough to impact positively on other aspects of life. one of the really important things to note about co-benefits is that they are sometimes a bit hard to monetize and account for, but they're still really important to take into account and to do our best to measure and assess them wherever we can, and to build them into the recommendations that we make. So hopefully that makes sense so far. And to illustrate this a bit more, I'm going to go through some examples of how this works in practice. So if we go with the example of walking and cycling. So if we look at reducing emissions, it's really important as we try and reduce our emissions from transport to reduce the use of diesel and petrol cars, use public transport more, use electric cars, but it's also really important to promote and make accessible and affordable and easy forms of active transport like walking and cycling. So it's a really, really good way of reducing emissions from transport. So that's kind of where you enter the thinking around walking and cycling. But then what you can also do is you can think about the wider benefits that increasing walking and cycling brings to the region. So like it's been shown time and time again, that increased walking and cycling is really good for people's physical and mental health. And you can see, if I go back a slide, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. Yep, I am. So you can see here that physical and mental health in the bottom left is one of our secondary objectives. And I'm going to go through some of these now. So we've got physical and mental health. So you have increased exercise from walking and cycling, which is really good for reducing the incidence of non-communicable diseases, for example, like cardiovascular disease, but it's also really good for mental health. Cycling has been shown to be really good for people's mental health. And then switching away from the use of diesel and petrol cars to public transport and active transport is also really good for reducing air pollution. This also links to health. For example, it can reduce the incidence of asthma, especially in children, but also everybody wants to breathe clean air more generally. Also links to wanting to improve skills, jobs and growth, because having good transport systems helps to make sure that all parts of the region are connected to job opportunities. And it also helps to ensure that the transport networks are meeting the needs of everyone in the region. So hopefully you can see how this kind of climate action also brings wider benefits to the region when you design it in the right way. I'm going to give another example. So another really good example is increasing green spaces. Green spaces are really good, sorry about that, because they help to reduce emissions because trees absorb carbon dioxide, which is great, but they also help to increase resilience. Green spaces can stabilize local climate. For example, they reduce the heat island effect. They protect against flooding if you put them in the right places, and they help to provide shade in really hot areas. They're also really good for physical and mental health. They can be spaces for exercise, but they're also really good for people's mental health as well. Ooh, sorry. And they're also really good for providing clean air, help to reduce pollution, and everyone likes being in green spaces, they're really nice. And they can also be used for kind of social and community spaces to help bring people in the area together. And lastly, we're going to go through one more example of homes. So it's really important that we look at the way that our homes contribute to emissions, and more energy efficient homes, changing the way we heat and power our homes can drastically reduce emissions. So it's really important to work on this from a climate perspective. And it's also really important to make sure that our homes are resilient to the effects of climate change in the region. So for example, making sure that the housing sector in our region is resilient to future flooding risk, for example. However, also acting on homes in terms of climate action is a really good opportunity to provide job opportunities, to retrofit the housing, but you can also have businesses who can provide low carbon products to the local and the global markets. Energy efficient homes have reduced heating bills, which is great, and poor housing and housing that is difficult to heat or poorly energy efficient can exacerbate health conditions as well. So these are all reasons why improving the climate stability of our homes can also improve our homes more generally and make them better for our economies and our health. So yeah, hopefully that all makes sense. And yeah, I think that's it from me. I think I'm probably slightly under time. But yeah, happy to take any questions either now or later.
Thanks very much, Rhiannon. As Rhiannon mentioned, please do provide us questions using the question facility in Zoom, and we have time set aside to answer those questions.
Lists in specific industries in the area about their views and awareness of climate change and its mitigations in our region. And I think this will help to inform a number of different aspects of our work, both in the immediate future as we kind of write those first couple of chapters up, as Julia's mentioned, and also potentially going forward in how we focus our work, both in terms of research and future areas we want to focus on, but also potentially in whether we need to consider our recommendations as having more of a hearts and minds approach towards the public in the region. And I think that's something that we don't necessarily have the evidence on as of yet, and that which these surveys and engagements with the public will help us to understand. So I think in particular, there's three different ways that we're engaging with the public and with specialist industries at the moment, two of which are live and open for the public, and I'm sure will be posted on the chat below soon. And the third is something that we'll be doing in the near future. So those three different ways are a general survey that's targeted at anyone living in the region, and that's currently live on our website at the moment. The second is requests for specialist submissions of evidence, which is more targeted at institutions or organizations, although also members of the public who have more detailed knowledge about specific areas of mitigation action already, or the implications of climate change in the region. And then the third part is the representative surveying. And I'll talk about each of these in sequence, so you can understand how they fit into us getting evidence from the public. So the first one, the general survey, which is targeted at anyone living in the region. So this is to a large extent the kind of the standard survey technique that you might see used for lots of these kind of commissions trying to understand the public's views on this issue. And what we're trying to do is to ask a variety of questions that give us a sense of a mix between the knowledge that the public in the region have, what behaviours they're willing to take, and also what areas they think that we should focus on. And I'll just go into a little bit of detail on a few of the different questions to draw out what we're hoping to get from this. So I think one of the first things we're asking on that survey is what appetite people within the region have for being at the forefront of change. And I think the reason we're really interested in this is, as Julia said, this region across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough has a lot of assets for combating climate change, such as the universities and the industry we have in the region, as well as natural assets, such as the potential for wind power in the region. But it also has a lot of vulnerabilities to what climate change is going to bring, such as the low-lying fenland and also potentially the peat in the region, which could be a vulnerability or could also be an asset, depending on what can be done with that. And I think that this means that we have a potential to feel both significant effects of climate change in the relatively near future, and also the potential to move faster in mitigating these potential effects. And we really want to understand what the public's willingness is to be at the forefront of cutting to net zero. And that doesn't mean if the public is definitely willing to be at the forefront, that means that can happen, or the converse as well, that if the public indicates to us that there's not necessarily a willingness, that means our recommendations would necessarily change. But I think it helps us to understand what the current situation is, and whether our recommendations need can definitely move at a faster pace in other areas, or perhaps need to consider what needs to be done to help bring the region along with these policies. I think the second part of that general public survey I want to talk about is a series of questions we're asking about how likely the public are to make certain lifestyle changes to combat climate change. And these include questions related to travel, to working arrangements, to heating in their homes, through to consumption. So thinking about things like buying local and perhaps reducing meat consumption. And I think the reason we want to ask about that is to help us understand where there might be quick wins in people's expectations of what needs to change to achieve net zero in the region, and where we may need to do more work to establish a need in the public's mind. So to some extent, it would be great if it came back that everyone fully understood that their behaviours in a variety of areas are going to need to change to achieve net zero in the near future. But we think that's not necessarily going to be likely, because I think that what we want to understand is to what extent have the people in this region got a full understanding of the potential behaviour change that is needed in order to support a move to net zero. And I think going into a bit more detail on one of those areas, we focused a fair bit in the survey on looking at transport and what the willingness to engage in various different potential transport changes are. And I think that's because transport is a significant contributor to emissions in this region, and also is something that most people engage in every day, whether through getting on public transport or traveling in private vehicles, or indeed making a choice to cycle or walk. And I think understanding what people's barriers to certain different sustainable forms of transport are, including electric vehicle uptake in the region, is a very important part of how we can engage the public in making the changes we need to achieve net zero. I also want to talk a little bit about how we've designed that survey, because what we're very aware of is that we want to make it as accessible and open to as many people as possible, but also to get the detail from people where they have that additional knowledge. So what we did is we, within the survey, we let people opt into either a short form or a long form version. And the short form version is by and large kind of tick boxing, saying quick opinions, no need to write longer answers. And then the longer form provides more detail on specific areas such as energy and buildings and nature, which allows people who have either more time or more interest in those particular areas to give us greater detail. But we didn't want to put off individuals who perhaps just want to provide a quick opinion. The second part of our public engagement, as I said, is seeking more specialised calls for evidence, including good practice, and also the effects of climate change in the region. And we're asking for this from any individuals or organisations in the region, which will help us to understand the more granular detail of the ongoing impacts of climate change, as well as case studies of work that's going on already. And then the last part of our engagement, which I mentioned a bit at the start, and it's I think very likely to go ahead, but still under consideration, is representative surveying of the population within the region. And this would use the first survey that I mentioned, or a very similar version, but we'd ask it to a representative group of people from the region. And we want to do this because we think it's more likely that those who will respond to the open survey available to the public will have specific views about the issues and might be highly motivated to respond to a survey on climate change. And whilst this is useful for us because it helps us to get views of people in the region and also to gain evidence about things that are going on, we also want to understand what people who might be initially less motivated or indeed able to respond to a survey on climate change think about the issue, because these are kind of people perhaps in the middle of a distribution when you're thinking about a distribution of how much people care about climate change initially. And those are the people who are perhaps most powerful for us to shift in either direction, because the people who are perhaps most likely to to, off their own back, respond to the survey are more likely to be highly motivated in either direction. So are more likely to be at either the right or the left end of the distribution of how much they care about climate change or how much they believe it's an important issue. Just finally, before I hand back to Ian, I just want to quickly mention why I think this commission is so important and why the evidence will be very useful for us. So I think that of course, the issue of climate change and its mitigation is an extremely complex one across the globe. But even when you break it down into national policy areas, it remains very complex. And I think translating national policy of net zero by 2050 to local areas creates a significant challenge, as those local areas have to understand what they can do, what they have the power over in order to achieve net zero by 2050, and also a slightly strange aspect of it, but what they don't have the power over and what they need to ask for support from central government to do, and what coordination is more appropriate at a national level. And I think, you know, in this region, and my sense is across the country, though Julia will have a better idea of that than me, that conversation is still ongoing as the interface between national and local government is working out which level of government is best suited to taking certain actions. And of course, getting that sorted in the relatively near future is going to be extremely important in allowing us to reach net zero in the time frame that we've set out, and even hopefully before that. And in terms of how the surveying fits into all that, as I said before, in order to get close to net zero by 2050 or hopefully by and large meet it, it will take immense local will and coordination across people's behaviours, across local government, and across a variety of other actors. And I think ensuring at the start of our work on this, at least the start of the Commission's work, that we have a really good understanding of what people's beliefs, what people's understanding of the behaviour that they will need to change, and what people's expectations are of their local government is crucial in order for us to design good policy that actually takes account of how people will behave in the region. So hopefully everyone will respond to our surveys and perhaps even give us a piece of evidence on work already being done, and also importantly spread it to communities that you're engaging with as well. So I think on that, I'll hand back to Ian.
Thanks very much, Ben. I mean, I think the point is that we are definitely open for engagement and really want to find out people's views and what's happening out there in the region. That's very important. We have a couple of questions. You can put questions in chat. It's slightly more difficult for me to track if you don't want to use the question facility, but that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to kick off for the question about peat. So emissions from peat in the region approach emissions from all other human activity. Addressing this will require radical changes in the way we farm the region. Will you have the courage to recommend such radical change? Who wants to lead off on this? Julia.
I think I better kick off on that one. We have spent already in our first few commission meetings quite a lot of time talking about the challenge of peat, and absolutely recognizing that, you know, potentially the peat emissions are the same scale as all the other emissions in the region. So we're very keen to look at peat in some detail. We are slightly challenged by the fact that there hasn't been a survey of the condition of the peat in the UK for many, many years, and another one is planned for 2023. So we know that we don't have accurate data, and we know that there is quite a lot of peat in the region that is quite heavily degraded, and it may be beyond the opportunity for restoration. So we're going to look at peat. It's one of the things we're not trying to do in the first tranche, because we recognise how complex, and indeed, of course, how sensitive it is. We should recognise that the Committee on Climate Change, in its net zero proposal that encouraged the government to change the target in the Climate Change Act to net zero, in that net zero report, pointed out that across the UK, it would require 55% of peatland to be restored. So there is a real recognition of the need for that. We're currently looking and working with a number of local groups about, given that we don't know the detail of the condition of the peat, but a number of local groups on producing who are, well, both us and them are working on, we found we're working on the same issue of what's the advice until we have a better picture. What's the advice of things that can be done, for example, no-till, for example, the appropriate crop rotations, for example, keeping peatlands covered with a plant during the winter. What are the kind of absolutely common sense things that we can recommend people do now? And I think we will also be having some very strong recommendations for the national government, that the new environmental land management scheme, which is coming in to replace the common agricultural policy payments, that absolutely needs to recognise and reward the actions that farmers will need to be taking to preserve and improve the quality and the state of our peatlands. So I'm sorry to say we're putting that off at the moment, but we do absolutely recognise this is a really challenging question, and it's a particularly challenging question for the region because of the amount of peatland we have here. So it's very much on our agenda. I don't think we're going to be able to come up with a solution to it because we really do need to know the condition of the peat, and that survey isn't going to be completed till 2023. But in the meantime, we will be having some recommendations about how can we do the best until we actually have robust data. So, but thank you very much. It's a really, really important question and one we're very, very conscious of.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Oh, did anyone want to come in on the last one?
Yeah, I was just going to say I quite like the question about like, oh, will you be brave enough? And I think like the key thing with this is that, you know, we're going with the science and the evidence and what needs to be done to keep the world as within our power, at least that we have to influence that within a safe level of warming. So it's about recommending what needs to be done to achieve that, to achieve the climate stability, and then what needs to be done in the local region. And if big changes do have to be made, it's then about making sure that those changes are done in a really inclusive way that like brings people together and that can bring other benefits to the region and stuff like that. So I'd say it's like big change isn't necessarily scary. It's about the way that you do it and why you do it and who you do it with, I think. So I was just going to pick up on that part of the question.
And how we maintain people's livelihoods,
yeah,
through
exactly.
through when change needs to be made.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Will you be putting a mechanism in place, such as community municipal bond, to harness community wealth and enable people to access a local low interest loan to make our homes as energy efficient as possible? You're on mute, Julia.
I'm happy to respond.
Okay, Ben.
I can respond a bit on that if you want, but Julia, please also go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say,
I'll take the silence.
Ben, I'll let you pick up, but after, I'm just going to say that's one of the reasons why we've brought Russell from HSBC onto, and who's a finance specialist, onto the on as a commissioner in order to look at ideas exactly like that, as to what kinds of initiatives can we do locally that will enable investment in really important low carbon projects, and what kinds of initiatives locally would we be able to draw in funds, for example, from pension funds and other financial organizations? What kind of things could we draw their funds in to enable there to be enough funding to really make a difference? But Ben, please let me hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. No, I was just going to say, whilst we haven't as of yet whilst looking at housing and how to effectively ensure homes are energy efficient, looked at specific funding mechanisms. As Julia said, we have a commissioner on board now who hopefully will be able to help us think through the financing initiatives in greater detail. We're kind of very aware of the need to consider how that retrofitting is funded. And I think in previous schemes, there's decent evidence that the way in which finance was potentially available for homeowners was perhaps too complex, or indeed not actually readily accessible in an easy form, and that provided a significant barrier to people actually engaging in retrofitting. But also, as I think your question kind of indicates, there are also barriers to how local authorities can provide funding as well. And we're very aware of the need to address these because I think there's a feeling both within the Commission and wider that we can't rely just on the demand of homeowners who can access finance through the kind of current markets available, or indeed just fund their own renovations themselves. If we rely on that for retrofitting across the country, we won't get anywhere near the level of energy efficient homes we'll need to get to net zero by 2050. So whilst the specific mechanism you mentioned isn't something we're kind of committed to as of yet or not, we are actively considering the financing of private home energy efficiency measures, and believe that to be a very important part of the recommendations we'll make on housing.
And can I add to what Ben said, which is that we're in an early stage of our work. So ideas like that are absolutely welcome. The more ideas we have to review, particularly, we certainly don't see ourselves as commissioners as having all the ideas. The more ideas people bring to us, the more things we can look at, and the better our recommendations and the stronger our recommendations would be. So ideas like that, bringing them to us is absolutely what we want you to do. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next question we have, when will you call a meeting with all those responsible for zero carbon on local councils to look at what we can and can't do to contribute to emissions reduction and adaptation individually and between areas?
Well, we're trying to do that at the moment. We have a consultant working for us who is Adrian Galt, who is the former Deputy Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. He worked there for about 11 years from its very earliest days. And Adrian at the moment is trying to pull together, working with the combined authority, to try and pull together all of the local council initiatives that are going on, and all of the kinds of data that local councils and surveys local councils have done. I must admit, when we started on the Commission, I assumed that somebody would have done that and all that might be available. So it's proving a little slower than we have anticipated it would be, but it's definitely happening, and anybody who can help us to do that more quickly, that's very much appreciated. If a meeting is the appropriate thing, then we'll have a meeting, but I think it would be useful for us to pull together the information first and make sure we understand what's been going on, rather than just having a giant meeting with lots of people. So we'll be certainly contacting individual councils too, and also other community groups. I mean, we've had some very helpful inputs already from, for example, from Carbon Neutral Cambridge. So all of those things are going on. If you think a meeting is crucial, then let us know, and let us know why you think a meeting is an important thing, because we certainly want to be open and engaged.
Okay, thank you. I should say there's many comments coming in on the chat, which I'm usually interpreting as helpful suggestions. So I'm not asking the panelists to respond to them, but if you want the panelists to respond, please do put them in questions. Although I will monitor chat just in case there's something that actually looks like it requires an answer from the panelists. Next question, will you be looking at waste management systems? Wisbech is threatened with a mega incinerator, 3 years to build, putting out over 150 kilotons of CO2, huge potential emissions from transport, building, etc. Waste coming from all neighboring counties. The government has the final say on this. Can you affect this at all?
We will certainly be looking at waste, and the Committee on Climate Change has pointed out that, of course, we are going to need to be thinking about carbon capture on things like incinerators if we're going to get to net zero, which puts a very different perspective on how much they will cost, and may make some of these solutions, may make people think twice about some of these proposed solutions. I can't comment on your specific situation, I'm afraid, but we will certainly be making recommendations to central government, and I hope that that they will take notice, that they will take notice of recommendations coming from all of the towns and cities and combined authorities who are taking initiatives of this kind. But of course, we can't guarantee that. I mean, we are an independent commission, so of course we will make recommendations to the combined authority, but there is no obligation on them to take our to act on our recommendations. But we hope that having set us up, it is absolutely their intention to act on our recommendations. But it's therefore key that we make some really good recommendations that are actionable.
Okay, I have another question here about consultation, and I think a few of them have come through. There's an increasing number of consultations on climate change through different bodies. What efforts are underway to coordinate and reduce the confusion that is arising among the general public?
I would say that's a very good point. We're trying to coordinate what information has come from those consultations in the region, and of course we're looking closely at what the National Climate Assembly has said, because that was a great cross section of the British population. So I think their attitudes and conclusions are probably very, very important and pertinent in terms of what we're thinking about. But we don't have the resources to be trying to coordinate everything, I'm afraid, although I can absolutely sympathize with the frustration about confusion and kind of overkill at these things coming to you from all directions. But I'll ask Ben, actually, if Ben, if you'd like to comment on that, because I recognize the problem and the potential irritation it may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, it's extremely important to make sure that there is that coordination. I think, we are, or at least the officers supporting us are in conversations with the district authorities that are within the area of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority. So we do get updates at meetings from various work going on within those district authorities. But I would also say, we're independent commissioners. We are, as Julia said, all voluntary. So we don't have, significant amounts of time to constantly engage. And so therefore, if anyone on this call does want to engage with anyone, please do reach out to us. That is exactly what we want to hear. We want to understand what's going on and the ways in which you believe that the district authorities or the local authorities in the region can, the policies that are currently taking place can interact with our work. As I say, whilst we're getting lots of reports and work from the officers supporting us, further engagement, I think, is in general very helpful. So yeah, we're definitely open to hearing from anyone if they think that there's relevant work that we don't seem to be engaging with. But I would say that it's very likely that we have at some stage engaged with each of the district authorities on the work they're doing. But please do continue to reach out to us and talk to us. As I said a few minutes ago, we recognise that coordination both between national government and local government, and then also within the various tiers of local government that exist in the region, is going to be crucial to ensuring that these policies are in any way successful. So this is certainly from the independent commissioners, at least, kind of we want to engage with various authorities in the region.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up a question from the chat because I think it's interesting. Is there a focus on the linguistics of climate change in narratives? And I'm tempted to hand over to Rhiannon on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think there's kind of two parts to this story. And I'm not a linguistics expert, so I'm kind of going to talk more generally about climate change narratives. And I think one part of the way we talk about climate change is about emphasizing how important it is to act. So there is, like, although it is like kind of doom and gloom, for lack of a better word, it is sometimes difficult for people, and sometimes it can be really overwhelming. I think we know that, eco-anxiety is a rising issue, especially among young people. But it is really, really important to get across the seriousness of the issue, and why it's really important that we take action that reflects that seriousness at the national and the local level. So I'd say that that's one side of the story, is making sure that people understand the seriousness of the situation. But I think the second side of the story is not presenting climate change and climate action. I mean, of course, changes and sacrifices and changes to behavior are going to be a really important part of what we need to do. But I think to kind of inspire people to be involved and to be part of the solution to this issue, we also need to have a framing that's a bit more positive as well, and like a vision of where we want to go and where we want to be as societies and economies, and how we can live in a way that is, in line with science and in line with nature, and takes care of the health of our communities and the health of the planet as well. So I think that second piece about building a more positive vision about, okay, so we do need to address this massive challenge of climate change, and there's nobody saying it's going to be easy, but at the same time, throughout this process, we can ask wider questions about, yeah, we do want everyone to be able to cycle, and we do want everyone to be able to get a clean piece of public transport to a job that they love, so, and that is part of the co-benefits picture, is building that slightly more visionary and positive narrative that, yes, we do need to address this really serious issue. Of course we do, and it's definitely a challenge. But at the same time, while we're making these changes, we can also envision the communities and the local areas that we also really want to live in as well. And we can make climate action part of that journey to building those societies that we really want to live in as well. So I hope that kind of answers your question in terms of how we're thinking about it. But feel free to add another question in the chat if that doesn't really answer your question. And that's also somewhat personal. That's the way I think about it as well. So I'm sure like other people have different views on what the right language and the right way of communicating is.
I think Ben might have an interesting comment on that too. But thank you there, Rhiannon, that was great.
Yeah, I think the way in which language is communicated is crucial. It's well evidenced that framing impacts on people's behavior. So I think it is really important to think about, whether this is communicated as something that people can take meaningful action on, whether it's communicated as something that, the community is getting behind, that their peers and friends are taking action on. Or whether, as in some places, climate change is kind of communicated as something that's very difficult to affect. And I think those can have kind of cascades on people's behaviors, potentially whether people kind of actually take action, then affects whether their neighbors take action, then affects whether there takes action and things like that. So using language carefully, both in framing the potential actions that people can take, and then also framing the problem as well, is really important. That's not to say that I or the Commission necessarily has the answers on what language to use and how to frame things, but I think it is just to say that it's important that we all consider and
Whoa.
Oh no.
Commission at individual level.
Okay. You just, it's okay. We lost a little bit there, but not much. Okay.
Sorry, can I build something again on what Ben said?
Yeah.
I think also building on Ben's thing about we need to have a narrative about climate change that is empowering to people and something that they can get involved with. So obviously climate change is a global challenge. Of course it's a global challenge, but the changes that need to be made to help us overcome that challenge, they do happen at the level of communities, at the level of individuals. And it's a fine balance between recognizing that, okay, yes, it is hard for an individual person to make all of the changes. And I think given how lots of these things are about infrastructure and energy, you know, and about making these kind of systemic changes, it's a lot, we don't want to put pressure on individuals to be like, oh no, you're the solution and we can just ignore all these wider issues. That's not the way to talk about it. But the way to talk about it is to say, no, you can be part of these bigger solutions. Here are the ways in which you can be part of it. This is, okay, fine, you can't change all of this at the individual level or at your family level, but your community can be part of the solution in this way. And you can advocate for your government to do this. And you can be part of the solution by making this particular thing that we need to be done translated to the local level. So I think it's about empowering people and showing people how they can be involved without putting the pressure on them to be the solution as one person, because it's a societal solution. And I think that's another reason why it's really important that climate action brings people together, because, you know, we can't do it by ourselves. We need to do it as communities, as societies, as nations, and as a global community. And so I think that that's another part where language comes in, is making people feel empowered whilst also recognizing that it's a group effort and it's something that we need to do together.
Okay, thanks very much. We're running out of time. I'm going to just have one last question, and I realize there's some that we haven't answered, and we'll figure out what to do about those and publish those. So I'm just really going to try to summarize this question. Basically, there's so many things going on with proposals to do with abstracting heat from waste, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many opportunities, but they all need multi-agency working. How can we make agencies work together? I think I'm going to start with Julia.
I think one of the challenges that I've seen it's come out with some of the comments and questions we've had actually is, which that's a sort of part of, is just in an area like Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, just getting all of the councils and the different councils and the combined authority working in a more coordinated way on this. You know, there's such complex mixtures of different responsibilities and accountabilities that live at different levels of our government system. Even that can make your headache fairly much, just trying to work out, you know, how you can actually get some of these things to happen. So I absolutely agree with you. I think we're beginning to see that in central government with the new climate cabinet and its various committees, which is starting to pull things together across different Whitehall departments. So they act as one on climate change policy and legislation. And that's a beginning to be an improvement. It needs to turn into a big improvement. And I think we've got to think about, how do we do that locally? How do we bring all the key actors together to work in an integrated way on this? And so it's been really good to have all the helpful comments from Liam from UK Power Networks, the distribution system provider, because they're absolutely key in terms of, you know, improving the electrification of transport, all of the initiatives in Cambridge, perhaps for electrifying into the city centre bus services and deliveries. We can't do that without Power Networks being on board and things. So it's absolutely key that we find ways to bring different agencies together. and that's something I think we need to think about how we do that on the regional level.
Okay, and this, thank you very much. This will absolutely be the last question. COVID has impacted our economy. Does the panel see the potential of the green economy to build back better, in particular by skilling a new workforce and enabling the potential? So I'll hand over to Rhiannon, and then I actually have something to say on that.
Yeah, so I was very keen for us to take this question because I think the answer to your question is absolutely. And I think that's especially in the context of COVID-19 and, you know, needing to give people good and secure jobs and something to look forward to as well. I think it's incredibly important that the recovery is green and the recovery is investing in jobs that are sustainable for the future, because, you know, green jobs are going to be with us forever. And what we need opportunities for people who are working in high carbon sectors or people who have been excluded from lots of these jobs historically to reskill and to be part of the solution and to be able to take up those opportunities. So I think there's kind of two sides to that coin, and that it's absolutely essential that investment going forward is green and is part of moving forwards and doesn't lock in further emissions, because the more you invest in things like fossil fuels, the more emissions we lock in. So it's absolutely so important that our economic recovery is green. And then the second part of that is that people need to be able to take those jobs. And it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for increasing the number of jobs, but also the quality of jobs, sustainability, and reskilling as well. So the investment needs to be there in building a green economy, but then also the opportunity for people to be part of that and to engage with that is absolutely essential. So from my perspective, like, really agree with that question. I think that's a great question.
Can I say a couple of words? I think there's been a lot of economic research on this recently, and there's one of the conclusions that that really sticks with me is that that in general, investments in the green economy give you 3 times as many jobs per pound of investment as investment in fossil fuel based industries and infrastructure. So, you know, if we need a recovery with jobs, a green recovery is absolutely right. And I think we've got to change the language, because I think we've said in this country, look, we can grow the economy despite reducing emissions. I think we've got to recognize that the language should now be, look, we can grow the economy, and the way to do that is by reducing emissions.
Okay, I'd just add that the Combined Authorities Local Resilience Plan has done a study on recovery, and environmental recovery was part of that. And so a lot of work was done there looking at to ensure that as we recover from COVID, that everything we do is geared towards ensuring that we reduce emissions. The other thing to say is that Cambridge Zero at the university have also just issued a very large report about green recovery. So there are lots of evidence for exactly what Julia has said. I would, at this point, like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank all the people that have submitted questions. I realize we have not answered them all, and we will be doing that going forward. And I'd like to thank everyone for giving up their time on a Sunday morning to join us. It's been a very, very interesting hour. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.